All right, welcome back, everybody. We've been talking about a book called Boundaries for Your Soul. And today we're going to talk about what happens when you run into the parts that other people have. What happens when you run into the emotions of other people, or some vulnerability of theirs, or some part of them that is protecting them in some way. And there's a great quote by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, which says, "If we could read the secret history of our enemies, we should find in each man's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostility." And I guess that would be our own hostility. So the idea is, if the people that cause me the most angst, if I could only see, if I only had special glasses, or I was able to read their secret history of their lives and read about what they've gone through and the suffering and sorrow, then my hostility toward them would be greatly diminished. One of the amazing pictures that I've seen is a picture of an iceberg, and a lot of times an iceberg, you only see about 10% of the iceberg above the water, and then underneath the water is the other 90%. And so when we talk about running into other people's parts or running into problems with other people and conflict, I imagine that I'm trying to get close to a person in a meeting or in a relationship, and all of a sudden I run into something. I don't know what I've run into, but I know I've run into a problem. I know I've run into a conflict. I know I've run into something, but I didn't think I was anywhere near close to running into something, right? Because it's the 90% under the water that I've run into, not the 10% above the water that I could actually see. Just a quick way of illustrating this is thinking about a couple that's having a fun outing together, and all of a sudden they find themselves in a big argument about the directions. They're coming back from the outing, and the woman says something like, "Do you know where you're going?" And she says it in a tone that really triggers the guy. And he says something like, "Of course I know where I'm going. I always know where I'm going. What do you mean?" And you probably have heard this argument before, and you can imagine how that might go. But what if we could see below the surface for the woman and see in her life's history that she got lost in life? Very early in life, she got lost. She made some wrong turns in her own life and got in some very vulnerable situations. And as it turns out, when they're driving back from an outing, that's what's coming up for her, inside her, although we can't see it underneath the surface. What if we could see underneath the man's life? What if we could see that this man was put on the spot at a very young age and asked questions like this: "Do you know where you're going?" And he froze up, and it became a very scary time for him, as he didn't know the answers to the questions he was being asked. See, it's helpful to see that both of them have parts that are emerging here, parts that are vulnerable, parts that are, and also parts that are trying to protect the vulnerable parts, because both of them have vulnerabilities, but you don't see that when you see the argument. All you can see is the angst and in the anger and frustration and the conflict. You can't see underneath that there's vulnerabilities and there's some soft spots for the husband and wife. So I just wanted to kind of share that, just to give us a visual of what we're talking about today. But what happens when someone comes and you need to respond to someone in need? What do? So someone shares a problem with you. Now what are you going to do? Are you going to agree with them about what they're saying? Maybe they're blaming someone else. Are you going to go ahead and blame someone else for this person's problem? That's one thing you could do. I know I've done that before. Or do you give the person a pep talk? Do you encourage them and help them recognize that they really don't need to feel the way they're feeling? They can just feel better because of whatever reasons you give them. Or maybe you minimize the situation and try to downplay it to avoid having to face the painful reality of what your friend has brought to you. Or you might try to fix the situation by offering a quick fix to a very complicated problem. Or, some of us who are Christians, we might bring out a Bible verse hoping that that Bible verse is going to completely solve their problems in like 5 seconds. Well, there are some better ideas, and these ideas emerge from the chapter of the book that I shared with you just now. And so some better ideas would be, what if instead we could become a Sabbath for the other person? That sounds really weird. What if we could become a Sabbath for the other person? I've never heard that before. But what if we could become a presence that invites rest and reflection for that person? What if we could practice taking a U-turn? In other words, our friend has brought us an overwhelming situation. Our friend is overwhelmed, and that could be overwhelming to us. But so not only do we see our friend's parts coming out, and not only are they talking to us perhaps about someone else's parts that have caused their parts to come out, now we're trying to help our friend, and now our own parts are coming out. We're maybe getting anxious or frustrated or angry or whatever. So we need to practice taking a U-turn. And if you don't know what a U-turn is, you might need to go back and listen to some of our first videos on this, because we can take the overwhelming emotions that come into our lives and we can turn them around and allow God to get the glory through them and become more healthy in the process. And that's what the U-turn process is all about. So I notice what's happening inside of me when someone comes to me in need. How am I feeling? And then I can acknowledge the other person is hurting by asking them, have you considered that this part of you exists for a reason and has good intentions? How might this part be trying to help you? Now, if I was speaking with the wife that I mentioned earlier, that wife might respond with something like this. There's a part of me that doesn't want to get lost again. And so when I feel like I'm getting lost in that car, I get anxious and I get scared, because it reminds me of when I was a much younger person and I got lost in life and got really scared in that moment. And that part wants to be kept safe and protected. So when my husband gets angry, now I don't feel safe and protected. I feel like I'm about to get lost, and now I feel like my husband's angry at me. So asking the person, have you considered that this part of you exists for a reason and has good intentions, can help them focus on themselves and not on the other person. And also to focus on how that part might be trying to help them. And in this case, we know the wife is feeling vulnerable, and so she needs to feel safe and protected. And what she's doing in this situation is not making it more likely that she's going to feel safe and protected. The tone that she's using and the words that she's using are causing her husband to be triggered. Another thing that we could do is we could ask the person how she feels toward the part that is hurting. Doing so may help her identify an inner critic. So the wife might respond to me if I ask her about that part that's hurting. She might say, that part's been with me for a long time. It's so wimpy, I don't like it. And there's a part of me that gets angry at the wimpy part, because this other part tries to cover over the wimpy part. And it does so by getting angry. So I yell at my husband about getting lost because I don't want him to see this vulnerable part of me that is really scared. Okay? So just asking her how she feels toward the part that's hurting might bring out a protector in this case and help her identify that she has two different conflicting feelings here. Another thing we could do is we could remind the person who has hurt her, remind her that the person who has hurt her is probably behaving from a part as well. So this will help her to understand that there's more to her husband than just the part that's hurting her. All she can see is the part that's hurting her, the part that gets angry because he clearly knows where he's going and doesn't want his wife asking him about it. She's putting him on the spot, and so he gets angry. But if we could recognize there's probably something underneath that anger, there's probably a hurting child in there, a child who was put on the spot when he was young. And so if she could begin to see that it's not that her husband's trying to hurt her, her husband's trying to protect himself and trying to protect that vulnerable part. What we could also do is we could offer to pray for the part of her that's suffering. So this part, there's a part of her that's suffering and vulnerable. We could offer to pray for that part. And we could, we could do that if the person's a Christian. We could do that even if the person's not a Christian. We could offer to pray for them. And some non-Christians will gladly allow us to pray for them in a situation like that. And this may be an opportunity for them to really come to know who Jesus is. What we could also do is offer to pray for the part of the person who hurt her, which would also be great because we know the Bible tells us to be peacemakers and tells us to pray for our enemies. In this case, the husband and wife feel a lot like enemies on their way back from that outing. In difficult situations like this, what do we want to do? We want to maintain intimacy. We want to experience close connection. And that involves getting curious about our own vulnerabilities and the ways that we seek to protect ourselves. So if this husband and wife want to deal with this situation and maintain intimacy and closeness, they need to be curious about their own vulnerabilities and the ways that they're seeking to protect themselves in this conversation. And so that involves learning to share constructively on behalf of those vulnerable parts or protector parts. So if I'm talking to the husband or wife, I'm trying to get them to talk about that hurt underneath, that vulnerable part of themselves, and also to recognize and tell their partner that that protector part is only there trying to cover a vulnerable part, trying to get them to learn to share constructively on behalf of those vulnerable parts. To say, as a wife, I get anxious when I don't know where we're headed or if we're headed in the right direction because of these other experiences I've had in life. And for the husband to be able to say, when I'm put on the spot, that puts me in a very vulnerable position. Sometimes we may need to take a break from the conversation and let the person know that we need a moment because we need to take a U-turn. And so we may need to put a pause button on the conversation, go and do the U-turn, and then come back. And then we might be able to experience one another. So instead of experiencing one another's reaction with the burden of having to figure out what it's about and how to deal with it, we can engage in our own process of reflection first, and then we can come back and speak more clearly and lovingly to the other person. A lot of times in an argument, there's just so much going on in our minds. We just can't handle doing 3 or 4 things like that. We need to take a break, do the U-turn, and then come back and be able to deal with this. So this is part 1. I think there's probably a part 2 and a part 3 coming on this, but this is all about how do we deal with the parts of other people. Today, mostly talking about what do we do when someone comes to us and they need help and their parts are emerging. They've run into someone else's parts and their parts are emerging and they're bringing those parts to us. That's kind of what this is about. So this has been a discussion on a book called Boundaries for Your Soul, and a chapter in that book. Allison Cook and Kimberly Miller wrote that book. Next week we'll come back and we'll do part 2 on the challenging parts of others that we run into. If you want to join us live, you can go to meetup.com/checkyourcompass. That's meetup.com/checkyourcompass. Or you could check out our videos on YouTube and Facebook as we post them 1 a week. Thanks for listening today.